Good afternoon from the UK here. You've joined OAG's regular monthly webinar looking at all things to do with aviation demand and drawing on the latest data that OAG has and guided by our experts. I'm Becca Rowland and I'm going to be hosting the webinar today. We've chosen as our theme today looking at connectivity, and I know that can mean different things to different people depending where you sit in the industry. If you're an airport, it might be about how easily travellers can fly to a destination, or how airlines are using your airport to enable hub access, hub activity, so people can transfer between flights. If you're an airline, it might be about your network, about code sharing agreements, or the number of places that you can reach on the airline. And if you're a traveller, connectivity might be just more about how to get from A to B with a minimum of fuss and without lengthy stopovers. So we're going to be moving back and forth across this topic and seeing how connectivity is being changed as the industry continues to emerge from a few difficult years. The focus of the webinar today will be Europe and the Americas, a bit more than other regions. We had a similar webinar this morning where we focused a bit more on Asia Pacific, and we had the Chief Strategy Officer from DoHop join us for that. That will be available on the OAG website in the next day or so. So if you wanted to look at that as well, then please do. As usual, please ask questions as we go through. We can see your questions coming in and we try where we can to pick them up and answer them as we go through. And then the questions are sort of relevant to the conversation we're having. So I'm joined today by John Grant and Rebecca Frankowski. Rebecca, great to have you with us again. I think you've joined us once or twice before, and I think you've got a promotion since you were last with us, Director of Air Service Development at Atlanta. Welcome back.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So how are things at the moment at Atlanta? How are you doing as an airport?
So 2022 was a good year for Atlanta. I think the last time I was on the webinar, I said we were going to end up somewhere between 90 and 95 million, and it was 93.7. So it's a pretty great year, but still well below what 2019, which was 110 or almost 111 million. So we have a little ways to go from a recovery perspective, but overall things are going very well.
And we've been watching and talking about this JetBlue Spirit on-off relationship, which is now going to be on, isn't it? How is that going to affect you in Atlanta?
So JetBlue and Spirit are a combined, I want to say like 3 or 4% of our actual seat capacity here in Atlanta. They would love to grow, so I don't know exactly what that means from a, once they merge together perspective, how that all plays out. But I know that they are both looking to grow in Atlanta. JetBlue announced recent service to LaGuardia, so we are seeing, and I think Spirit is either announcing or has announced that they are going to be expanding service in Atlanta as well. So they continue to grow. So we expect that that's going to continue here in Atlanta.
Great. Well, I'm sure we'll hear more about what's happening in Atlanta, as well as any other insights you've got for us as we go through the webinar today. John, welcome as always. You sounded quite excited this morning, the biggest aircraft order in history. What's that about?
Yes, 470 from Air India, which is a huge order. Airbus slightly the winner against Boeing. I think it was 250 plays 220 or something. It's funny, aircraft orders, the way that it was timed. So it was almost late evening in India, but it was just the beginning of the day in the US. So President Biden could send a social media message saying how delighted he was, and President Macron could also make an announcement in France about new jobs and all of these sort of things. The politics of aircraft orders never surprises me. But yeah, really interesting. So you have Air India, who are suddenly now looking to build out. First order, I think, for 20 years that they've placed for new aircraft. Some would say 19 years too late, but that's their opinion. But you've got Saudi Arabia on the other side, and suddenly the big three Middle East carriers have got a bit of competition coming their way. They are the jam in the sandwich of the Indian subcontinent, Saudi Arabia Vision 2030. So I think it's going to be fascinating. How do they respond? Because they're not going to let their market share just disappear overnight. So it's going to be a right royal battle.
They've had a good head start,
I
though, haven't we? I mean, I think it's probably 20 years since we first commented about the potential of an airport like Delhi in terms of its geography, and it's, you know, it's taken a while to get there. We perhaps didn't see what's coming in Saudi Arabia coming in the same way, but you know, the Gulf carriers and the Gulf hubs have had a good few years head start, haven't they?
Probably 35, 40 years head start. Terminal 3 in Delhi was, you know, supposed to be the inflection point where suddenly everyone was going to route through Delhi. It was going to be a super hub, big local market, which, you know, like in Rebecca's case, a good local market combined with connecting traffic is the perfect scenario. So you would think that India would do very, very well with a super hub, or even 2 super hubs. So yeah, fascinating times. Look forward to seeing how it shapes out.
Yeah, very interesting move there from Air India. Well, let's start our look at what's happening in the industry. We always start with John giving us a bit of an update on where we're at in terms of global capacity. I often say this, we look at capacity rather than traffic because we have the ability to get a bit of a forward view. Traffic data comes in a little bit behind. So we've got on the left here global capacity, and on the right it's split out by domestic and international with comparisons with the last few years. It's getting there, isn't it, John? It's creeping up, and international, am I right in thinking the international capacity is getting closer to that 2029 level, isn't it? Inching up.
It is. Yeah, inching up. We're last 6-7 weeks we've been sort of in this mid 90,000 seats per week across the globe. It's increased this week. Half term in Europe sees another 750,000 being added. So it's, you know, it's an interesting picture. We're getting closer and closer. The US domestic market has more seats now than it did pre-pandemic in 2019. Which is good, and you know, there are selected countries that are way ahead of where 2019 levels as well. Places like Mexico, Colombia have performed very, very strongly. So we're making great progress. I'm not concerned by the dip that you see there in the dash of projected capacity. Once Chinese airlines have sorted out their own schedules, which we've yet to see, and they're published and given to OAG and put in with reservation systems, you know, that's going to put us back up again to where we are now, and maybe even edge us a little bit closer. Personally, I don't think we'll get past 2019 capacity this year. There's just too many headwinds in terms of resources, available equipment. You know, I was talking to Fly Dubai earlier this morning, and they were saying their fleet plan is hampered. It's difficult. Boeing tends to deliver at least 4 weeks late on an aircraft order, and then the aircraft seat manufacturer delivers another 4 weeks late after that particular delivery. So, you know, they're working on timelines where aircraft are 2 to 3 months behind where they expected them to be. And it's not just that, it's even more fundamental things like pilots and being able to get the pilots, get them trained, keep them. There's a lot of churn, people being attracted to other airlines. American Airlines Pilots Association's Philadelphia representative wrote a letter to all his local pilots saying they should apply for jobs in Delta at the moment because that's where the best money is, and American won't match those offers. So, you know, we've got challenges all over the place, and that's before 470 new aircraft come into India in the next 10 years.
And Rebecca, at Atlanta, how are you doing there compared to this picture John paints of we'll come to the numbers for the US, but the US sort of being back where it was in 2019. I think the hub airports are a bit behind that, aren't they? They're just taking a little bit longer to come back.
Yes, that's correct. So when I look at January through July, which is what I looked at, I think from a seat perspective, by June or July, we're back to about flat with 2019. But the
Great.
first, January through May, we're still behind. So I think overall, from a seat perspective, for that period, we're down about 4% compared to 2019. And then, but if you look at flights, and I know we'll probably get into that a little bit later, it's actually down much greater than that compared to 2019. So,
and this is a resourcing issue, is it? It's not a passenger demand issue. It's about resourcing and people and staffing, isn't it? Or is it a mixture?
it's probably a mixture. So, obviously they took a bunch of markets out of capacity in the pandemic, and some of those markets have come back and some of them have not, particularly on the international side. It's been a lot slower to come back. On the domestic side, we're pretty close to where we were in 2019. So that's more on the international side than I would say on the domestic side for us.
So I guess that the hubs are taking a bit longer just because they've got more exposure in the international markets than many American airports, haven't they?
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination though too of aircraft that are available, the piloting issue, all of those things come into what the capacity is and overall. And like I said, we're back to flat on seats in about June or July. So hopefully the headwinds stay, don't cause more of a problem further down the road, but we'll see.
Yeah, I was looking at another webinar actually about the US economy, and just was struck by, despite the sense that economically there are headwinds, actually households have a fair bit of reserves, and the expectation for travel is that people will really want to travel still, and some of that money that they've accumulated over the last few years, the savings, the money they've not spent on other things, is going to be spent on travel. So hopefully it'll be a good year for Atlanta. Let's have a look at some of the country markets in Europe and the Americas. We've got a group of them we've shown here. Mexico, Turkey, Brazil, Spain, US, all over the next few months going to be positive against 2019. So yeah, interesting times for those. Germany's a strange one, John. Can you explain to us? I think you did last time in the last webinar what was happening in Germany, but we've got a bit of a dip and then an increase. What's behind this?
Yeah, at its broadest level, I don't think anyone can explain Germany, can they? But this is more related to Lufthansa and Lufthansa's capacity, which is probably amongst the slowest to return, and the migration to train services that has been directed by the government and partly by the airlines themselves. So that's why we see capacity down, but it does come back over the summer season, but it's still going to be one of the lagging markets in Europe. And I think, it'll be interesting to see what that means in terms of profitability for the German airlines, because is this a game of yield management and very high airfares? I mean, I flew with Lufthansa a couple of weeks ago on a long haul flight, wasn't an empty seat on the aeroplane. So, I don't think it doesn't strike me that it's a problem with demand. It's about capacity management and how they're going forward. But generally, all of these markets are looking quite strong. Mexico has just been a really positive outlier throughout the whole pandemic. They didn't close down, they stayed open, lots of tourists coming down from the United States. It was one of the few ways you could get into the US from Europe. You go and do 2 weeks holiday in Cancun, then you could just walk into the United States without any issues whatsoever. So it's a mixed picture. I think obviously Turkey may take a bit of a hit given the horrible events that have taken place in the last 10 days. But generally you have to be optimistic about Western Europe and North America and the Americas generally. It's the better half of the world. We're still struggling in Asia, as we discussed this morning.
I've been looking at Turkey actually this week, and you know, it's been a real success story in terms of capacity and particularly inbound tourism this last year, and their hopes were very high, and we can still see that capacity reflected in the numbers here. Anecdotally, we're hearing that people are cancelling holidays to Turkey, but we would really hope that people still go to Turkey, because I think Turkey will need the income from tourism more than ever. So hopefully the Turkish authorities, which have done a good job with their promotion of them as a destination, can keep that up despite what's going on. We've got a question from. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I was going to answer that question that we got here about, you know, why
Yes,
from Craig.
it's an easy answer. We've got a question from Craig Hefferman. Explain this.
Explain this. Well, partly it's because capacity is yet to be filed by some airlines, and that means we've got a bit of a dip. And it's also really, really strange how seasonal things such as Easter can affect capacity. And it is probably one of only two major holidays, stroke seasonal demand activities, or three, Chinese New Year as well, that take place at varying times in the year. So it can have quite a significant impact on capacity and demand at particular moments. And that's what I think we're seeing.
So this is particularly China, isn't it? The point, you know, we've got a slide about China, but you know, this is the point at which we move from a traditional IATA winter season into a summer season, and if airlines haven't filed their summer season schedule yet, then we see a dip, don't we? And the Chinese are traditionally very late in filing that schedule.
Yeah, and of course we got the complexity of the reopening or the relaxation in travel requirements into and out of China. So Chinese airlines and others are grappling with that right now. But yeah, I think we can be confident that all countries worldwide will step up once we get those Chinese schedules.
Yeah, so let's have a look at China. Got a slightly complicated chart here. I hope it was simple to me, but hopefully it doesn't bamboozle when you first look at it. We've got three lines here. Yellow is April capacity versus April 2019. The grey line is March, and the black line in the centre is February. So it's looking at capacity from China, so just international capacity, to each of these regions, and showing how it improves versus 2019 as we move through the year. My looking at this says things are getting better, which we would be pleased with. And if we look at the numbers on the left, you know, key markets like North America going from 94% below 2019 in February to 74% in April seems like an improvement. But your sense, John, is that it's going to be still a slower, gradual reopening of international services from China.
I do. I think what you see here is the initial capacity that's been put in place principally by the Chinese carriers who are looking to restore international links, get some hard dollars to pay for all their bills and their fuel and aircraft. And it's, you know, it's got a long way to go. I can't see China really coming back until probably second half of the year, maybe even into September and October. Number of reasons. Some airlines are struggling to find the resources to operate back into China, particularly within the Southeast Asian region. You know, they're going to have to drop other destinations because they don't have the resources. They can suddenly increase either aircraft utilization or the number of hours flown by staff to add China back to their networks without dropping something else. In Europe, we have the Russia-Ukraine situation. You can't fly over the Russian airspace, and that applies to US carriers as well. That means extended journey times. I was looking at the British Airways schedules to Beijing, 2019, that was about a 22.5-hour round trip journey for an aircraft. But it was nicely scheduled. It was integrated into a one-day program. It worked very well. Their current schedule, which they bring back in May, is a 26.5-hour schedule with a 15-hour flight returning from Beijing. And that means that they've had to adjust their slot usage at Heathrow, reschedule other flights. They're going to miss connections they previously connected onwards to. And maybe the most alarming thing about this is, from my experience coming back from Tokyo last week with Swissair, who are excellent, by the way, they had 4 flight deck on the service because it was a 15-hour flight. Now, if you've got to have 4 crew on a flight of that length, and you could operate a New York or a US service with a 2 crew complement, given the resource challenges we have at the moment, that's a real burden on European airlines, and that's why I think we're seeing a slower recovery from those. Rebecca, I mean, your US airlines are not showing any real interest in going back to China, are they?
No, so, you know, in having conversations with the airlines, they were really waiting first for China to reopen. And since that's kind of started and stalled, I think that, you know, that's one challenge. And like you said, with Russian airspace being closed, the flights that were scheduled out of the US can no longer take the routes that they used to take. So that resourcing issue of pilots, of flight attendants, of the whole crew, it becomes a big issue when you're looking to fly to China versus you're looking to fly somewhere into Europe, where it makes it a lot easier to fly back and forth, and you can easily move the crew around there versus all of the flight times and all of the struggles that you have in China.
These new balloons that people are trying as well, Rebecca, you know, they don't seem to be all that popular. I mean, passengers are complaining it's a bit chilly underneath those when you get up to 40,000. And then, you know, occasionally you get an F-16 come along and try and wipe you out over Canada. So yeah,
that doesn't seem
it's going to take no, it's going to take a time before this is sorted and we get back to, you know, the trend is there, the pattern is there. It is going to get better. You know, group travel is now permitted from China, although only to selected destinations. So things are moving in the right direction, but it's a slow burner. It's not going to happen quickly.
Okay. We've got a few slides coming up now where we are going to look at just some of the sort of industry metrics that we're observing and comment on them. And I think this one was quite interesting. We were looking at, well, on the top, we've got the number of carriers by region. John and I often talk about this and the fact that there are still so many airlines and we haven't really seen a reduction. We haven't seen consolidation. And this morning's webinar where we had Wana from DoHop was interesting because she was saying there's no concern about the number of airlines, that actually what's important is the partnerships that they generate. But 500 airlines in Europe does still seem quite a lot. The chart on the bottom shows frequencies and seats and how they compare with 2019 by region. And what we're seeing now is this very distinct, very marked difference across all regions apart from the Southwest Pacific, where seats have dropped more than frequencies. And so the upshot of that is we've got larger aircraft size, and we will talk about that in a moment. We've got another slide. But John, do you want to comment on the number of airlines that we're seeing?
Yeah, so just to sort of clarify, that 500 is any airline flying into and out of the European region, isn't it? So it's not just European domiciled airlines. But you could argue it shows you how competitive the market is, and there's lots of consumer choice and all of these sort of things. But many of those remain sub-scalable and very small and very fragmented, which I think is, you know, where through the pandemic where we saw the risk and the exposure, and they're not very well diversified. You know, they're could be geographically located in just one city, and that city's economy collapses, or the airline collapses, and then the city's economy collapses. We've seen that in parts of Europe, but I think it's just mind-blowing when you think how badly the industry was impacted by COVID-19, and you think how many airlines are still operating around the world. We've, any other industry would have seen much more decimation of players. There would have been fewer airlines. The fittest of the fittest will have survived. We still have some very unfit, fat airlines operating in Europe with various structures of state aid and financing protection that you think, how did they get through the pandemic? And that's the same in Africa. It's really tough in Africa. We saw some airlines collapse, but not as many as we expected.
I think that's really interesting, John, and we could talk about that a lot. But I think this business of the larger average aircraft size is really interesting. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, where we've the charts here just show the average number of seats per aircraft in North America for this week and for the same week in 2019. So we've gone from an average aircraft size of 116 to 130, and in all the, I was going to say years, but decades I've been in the industry, I've never seen that sort of change happen quite so fast. Normally you bring in some, an airline will bring in some larger aircraft, but then there's also some smaller aircraft, and that average aircraft size creeps up. So why is this? Can we explain this?
Yeah, well, because there's fewer small aircraft being operated. I mean, Atlanta is a great example. 20 years ago, the place was flooded with Embraer 145s, 135s, sitting on the tarmac, going off to all sorts of places in the south of the US. They're not there anymore. Many of them have been replaced by single aisle A320s, and regional cities in the US have been dropped completely from their networks. It's a function of the situation we find ourselves in at the moment. If you were an environmentalist, you would say perhaps it's good, it's sustainable aviation, we're moving more people on one flight. But we need to track the carbon emissions on the aircraft to see how accurately that is reflected in the data. And of course, OAG's got that. But Rebecca, you were full of those small little aircraft, but now the world is changing, isn't it?
Yeah, I did look back, and I think in 2013, like 26% of all of the seats were on a CRJ, and now the largest percentage of seats are on like the A320s. If you count A320s and 737s, it's over 50% of the market. So we have seen an uptick in the gauging of aircraft, and that's been over time. But yeah, I think part of the big increase compared to 2019 is also because of COVID and taking aircraft out of service. So we had a lot of MD-80s, MD-90s. Those are no longer in the system. So some of the aircraft being retired because of COVID have impacted, I think, when you are doing comparisons to 2019, what that average size looks like.
And you were saying to us earlier in the week that you actually saw this as a long-term trend.
Yeah, we've seen a decrease in CRJs and Embraers over time, and I can't remember what year it was, but we had over 1 million operations in Atlanta mid 2000s, and obviously with the upgauging of aircraft, we haven't even hit 1 million, I think, in the 2010s. So we've come close. I think we were at 900,000 in 2019, but we've continued to see that trend of there's not any more CRJs, Embraers. All of those smaller planes are really going away and moving to the what we are Aircraft Design Group 3, so 737s, A320s, that kind of thing.
That's and what does that mean for connectivity at an airport such as yours? When you've got there's a real crunch in terms of resources at the moment and staffing, does this make it easier to, if you've just got, fewer of those, flights coming in, fewer gates that have to be sorted out? Does this make life a bit easier?
So, I alluded to this at the beginning. We're down about 4% in seats, but we're down about 15% in operations. So that really speaks to that upgauging of aircraft. For the airport, it's great to have a longer time for people to connect because we end up with more revenue from concessions and from,
Who knew? Who knew?
shopping and all of these things. So having longer connection times for the airport are really great. From a passenger perspective, obviously that makes it a little bit tougher, particularly if anything goes wrong. So, if there used to be one flight an hour and you could connect, and if you missed your flight at 9, you could go at 10. Now you have to sit and wait 3 hours. Again, from the airport perspective, it's great. From a customer experience perspective, it's not.
But equally, if that's the only option available, then the customer's going to have to learn to live with that. It's a consequence of where the industry is.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so this is a trend we're seeing pretty much everywhere, which is interesting. Perhaps we should have some of the smaller airframe manufacturers come in and talk to us about where they see the market, John.
I think the other thing here, of course, Becca, is what it means in terms of long-term planning and all those wonderful projects we get involved in terms of master planning and number of gates required, busy hour, all of those pieces of work that are done around developing and rebuilding airports. If we're moving in this direction, what does it mean in terms of number of gates that need to be built or new terminals that need to be created? It's going to have people rethinking about what they do and how they do it. I mean, I know sadly some airports in North America that during sort of 15 years ago were redoing their master plans and planned their runway lengths based on regional jets that would be able to dip into and out of those cities. And now they've gone, they have runways that are too short for 737s or A320s. And so essentially have closed themselves to the supply chain of capacity.
Yeah. Okay, let's look at another industry metric, the proportion of air services that are low cost versus legacy. And I know in the webinar this morning, we sort of ended up with a discussion that said, oh, there's, perhaps it's not as simple, is it, these days to say, what's a legacy, what's a low cost airline. But in terms of the sort of generally accepted low cost definitions, we're seeing low cost share of frequencies of flights going up pretty much everywhere. Markets may still be a bit smaller than they were pre-COVID, but the share of low cost has risen, and particularly we're seeing the likes of Ryanair do very well, aren't we, John?
Yeah, we are. I mean, the business model's easier. It's point to point. It's more flexible. It can flex. I mean, in Europe this week, half term, 750, three-quarters of a million extra seats. 90% of those from low-cost airlines who are able to just turn the tap on and put more capacity into the market really quickly. And legacy airlines can't because either they're slot constrained, they don't have the resources, or they currently aren't able to move quick enough to take advantage. So it's interesting to see what's happening, and it's not just in Asia and it's not just in Europe. In the US, you've got Spirit, JetBlue, Allegiant, Frontier, all rapidly growing. Frontier moving into new markets. Rebecca, I think they've moved into Atlanta, haven't they? Yeah,
so I mean, they've been in the market for a while in Atlanta, but they've really grown substantially in the past couple of years. If you look at 2019, I think Spirit and Frontier were, from a seat capacity perspective, they were maybe about 2.5 million seats. And in 2022, they were up over 6 million. So it's a pretty big growth trajectory. They've added a lot of capacity. Frontier has added international capacity, mostly on markets that Delta already served, but adding that low cost component and increasing and stimulating the market. And if you look at the growth overall, so JetBlue didn't start in Atlanta until 2017. I think 2019 was actually their peak year for seats, but they are continuing to add capacity in Atlanta, adding routes, that sort of thing. So, they're growing. I think if you look at 2013, I think they're 10 times what they were in 2013. They maybe each had one destination, and now, Spirit is, I think, the third largest from a seat perspective and fourth largest from a passenger perspective, behind Delta, Southwest, and American. So they've surpassed, United, one of the legacy carriers, and they are growing far faster than any of the legacy carriers are in Atlanta.
Yeah.
And I think, Becca, an interesting part of all of this is that low-cost airlines are not just selling a seat. Many of these have their own holiday divisions. In the US, I think Allegiant sells most of its seats to destinations where they operate the hotels or own the hotels. It's almost a vertically integrated tour operator like we see in Europe. From that perspective, they're all masters of ancillary revenues, and getting as much money from the passenger as they can during the whole travel experience. And it was interesting to see EasyJet's results a couple of weeks ago in their investor presentation, because they actually talked about revenue per seat rather than revenue per passenger. So it's a subtle difference when you begin to talk about how much revenue I can get off every seat I operate, whether it's filled and it has a bum on it or whether it's empty. It's all about the seat. So I think that's a fascinating change. And you have Fly Dubai. They're the startup part of Emirates. They test markets out on behalf of Emirates. I have a business class with a live flat seat. They were low cost, but they're becoming more of a hybrid. Same with FlyNAS. These airlines, we're getting back into that position where we have lots of carriers who are in that sort of grey area that are not low cost, low value, but are not high cost and extremely high value. It's the bit in the middle, I think, that is really where people are headed. And I'm not sure that's going to help them in the long term, because they're going to all morph into one sort of product and entity.
But we're seeing some quite successful models where there's a legacy airline being linked to a low cost, aren't they? Whether they're within the same sort of group, as you say, with I guess with Emirates and Fly Dubai, or whether it's EasyJet doing virtual.
Vueling within IAG, Aer Lingus in part within IAG. There's all these connections. We've had a question about Canadian low-cost carriers. Is Flair doing well? I guess it's all relative. Are they doing better than last week? Maybe. Really, really difficult for low-cost carriers in Canada. There's a couple of very big or relatively big airlines that will sit on them and make life really tough. And it's hard to see year-round business for these guys.
Yeah, there's your answer, Philip. Thank you for asking it. Okay, let's have a look at the US. We decided we'd have a look at the summer season by state. We've got two charts here. One shows with sort of heat map how each state is doing for capacity, just domestic capacity, versus the summer 2019 at the top and versus summer 22 at the bottom. So just a few bits of strong blue here, which is New Jersey, New Hampshire, where they've seen capacity fall the most. Overall, versus before the pandemic, Florida doing very well, isn't it, John?
Yeah, well, it was doing well before, and it's doing even better now. I mean, I think, Rebecca, wasn't there an edict from the FAA pre-Christmas saying they couldn't accommodate any more air traffic into Florida airspace or something? It's sinking under the pressure of air service.
Yeah, I do believe that's correct. Florida has, so particularly Miami, I think they actually were better in 2022 than they were in 2019 from a passenger perspective. A lot of that has to do with what we were just talking about on the low cost side, a lot of increased capacity on the low cost side. And Florida, Miami in particular, has always been kind of that connection point between the US and South America, Central America. So with Mexico being open, that probably also helped them to have a lot of passengers that were flowing through Florida and then into Mexico and later on into South America and the Caribbean. So Florida has been an interesting case. I mean, usually people think of Florida and they think of Orlando and Disney and all of that, but really there's been a shift to Miami.
Yeah.
And it was interesting during the pandemic, Becca, you may recall we showed some slides, and some of the US states that performed really well were those that were sort of outdoor destinations, you know, the iconic sort of imagery of the forest, the national parks, plenty of wide open spaces. And there was a subtle shift of capacity towards those destinations because in the domestic market, the perception was it was a safe place to go for a holiday, you know, wide open spaces, more chance of seeing a bear than a human being. And now, basically the tide has turned and it's going back to where it's always gone. And that's the nature of this particular market and the way it behaves. California has performed quite poorly, I think, in relative
what
terms.
this chart doesn't show is just the size of the markets. You know, California, you know, is I think the largest of these markets with 66 million seats this summer. So we don't get that sense by displaying the data in this way, just how big some of these markets are.
Yeah, but if we compare that to 2019, I think you'll see California's down about 10%. So, you know, the recovery there is not as great as we're seeing in other parts of the US.
Is that partly that so much of it would be international in California, that there's it's a staging post for a lot of flights further west?
Yeah, partly the Asian and the Chinese markets, but even the domestic capacity is down quite a bit.
Okay, well, we'll be watching what happens in the US. So thinking more directly about connectivity, OAG in their analyzer tool have an element connections analyzer, which allows us to basically count up all the possible connections at an airport, flights coming in to flights going out within certain parameters. And what I've done here is taken data for two airports, Singapore and Atlanta, all the connections for this Friday, and then also compared it with the same Friday, the third Friday in February in 2019, so before the pandemic, that happened within a 6-hour window and with a security of 150, which I'm sure is defined somewhere on the OAG website if you want to understand security and you don't know it now, but it's sort of how direct the routing is. So, you know, comparing these bars here, Singapore down 51%, Atlanta down 40%, this reflects what happens when you've got fewer flights. You just have a lot fewer connections, don't you?
You do, and it doesn't take a lot for it all to begin to tumble down. You lose a couple of flights, and you know, if that flight happens to be arriving in the peak hour or on the peak wave in Atlanta, for instance, it would have connected, given the parameters we have there, 200, 250 flights quite easily, and they're lost. You multiply that by losing 10, 12, 20 flights, and suddenly it all comes down. It all falls down dramatically. And for the airport, I don't know, is that good or bad? I mean, you can argue connecting traffic doesn't actually produce much in terms of revenue for the airport. They might grab and go a sandwich as they fly from one gate to the next. But those connecting passengers also allow the network to be as large as it is, because without those connecting traffic, the local demand wouldn't sustain 5 or 6 flights a day.
What's your view, Rebecca, on that? I mean, you see from an airport point of view, there is some upside with having a bit longer dwell time in the airport. And you could argue, I've chosen the 6-hour window here, you know, you could choose an 8-hour window, or you could say, actually, travelers don't want to spend more than 4 hours waiting. But, you know, we'd get slightly different results if we change the window.
Yeah, well, and again, from an airport perspective, if you have a longer connection time, that typically means that people aren't running through the airport, particularly in Atlanta. If you have to connect from, concourse A to concourse C, and you have to go downstairs and all that, that takes away from dwell time. So if you have more time, it tends to be more spending from a passenger perspective. They'll stop and grab a water, they'll stop and eat somewhere rather than just grab and go. But it's also from an airport perspective better from a gating. So the fewer flights we have, the easier it is to gate, and there's less changes to gates, which is always fun for passengers. There's less changing of gates if you have fewer flights. So from that's kind of the upside. On the downside, it does cause problems when you want to have more people connecting through. And we sort of saw in the pandemic. So pre-pandemic, I would say it was about 70% connecting, 30%, and it's shifting back in that direction. But during the pandemic, it was probably closer to 50-50. And that's, I think, the first time we've seen those numbers in the airport in a very long time. So, as we're removing ourselves from the pandemic, as traffic is coming back, I expect that we'll shift more towards that connection time. I think flights will be added back in, but they're still trying to figure out from a resourcing perspective how that all works out.
Yeah. And we were just talking about low cost, but I guess in a situation like Atlanta, the connections are really just happening primarily on Delta, aren't they?
So, Delta is 80% of the market. They have other SkyTeam members. So, there are people who connect internationally on some of the other, KLM, Air France, Korean, things like that. So some of those connections are going to continue just because of the SkyTeam partnerships. But for the most part, it's Delta passengers or SkyTeam passengers who are connecting in Atlanta.
Yeah. Okay. OEG's got another tool in its analyzer toolbox, which is Traffic Analyzer. And this data is taken from Traffic Analyzer, where we have the ability to look at what the proportion of traffic at an airport is that's going through the airport, using it as a connection point, a transfer point, or using it on an O&D basis. And so we've chosen a bunch of airports in Europe and a bunch of airports in the Americas, and just show what that was in 2019 and what it was in 2022 in terms of the proportions. I think what struck me was actually how close it is in terms of the connecting proportion of traffic now to what it was before. That in most cases it's a lower proportion than it was in December 2019, but not a lot lower. So it seems to be these airports are re-establishing their role, or maybe they never lost that connecting role.
Yeah, and I think this is also a bit of a myth buster in some cases, isn't it? If you look at London Heathrow, everyone says to me it's a global hub, and I keep saying no, it's not really a global hub. And when you look at the number of passengers who are local versus connecting, the local market is what, 75% of all the passengers passing through the airport. And obviously compare that to somewhere like Frankfurt, where typically in 2019, every second passenger was a connecting passenger. It's slightly higher at the moment. Los Angeles displays the same traits, even more noticeably than what you see at Heathrow. Los Angeles as a connecting airport is probably only 1 in 5 passengers are connecting somewhere. And most of that is probably connecting from somewhere in California or literally the East Coast into Los Angeles and then flying on elsewhere, and in most cases onto another US domestic point.
And I think this morning in the webinar we showed airports in the Middle East and in Asia, including Dubai, and I think it's always a surprise, isn't it, for people to see that actually 50% of the traffic at Dubai is O&D. It's not connecting. But I guess, like with London, it's having that strong base market actually helps your ability to grow and be a large airport and be a hub as well. So it's a sort of it's two things going on, isn't it?
Yeah, let's not kid ourselves. The United Kingdom's major hub airport is Amsterdam Schiphol, and if the two guys from Schiphol are listening, then they can buy me a beer at some point for saying that. But the other part of this is, if you look at the US airports, you know, their connecting product and their connectivity is very different from what we see in other parts of the world. International to international connectivity through a US airport is really, really challenging. It's not something that functions very well. Or am I giving it a bad press, Rebecca?
So if you think about it from the perspective of the United States and how big the United States is, typically when people are connecting from international, they're going somewhere else domestically in the US because it's such a big area. You know, there's some instances of international to international, but that's not typically, I mean, New York may be the exception to that. There's not a lot of airports that actually sort of have that offering that you can connect in and then go somewhere internationally pretty seamlessly, you know, or have a lot of international connectivity outside of you know, the US. Like I said, JFK, LA, maybe from Asia in, and then maybe to some South American destinations. There's not a lot of US airports that sort of offer that connectivity internationally.
And that's actually the same in China as well, where we see a very similar characteristic through Beijing and Shanghai. Most of the connected traffic you see through there is to those domestic points. I guess, as you say, it's a function of the huge domestic markets that exist.
I guess we see it here located in Europe, that if we want to travel to the Caribbean or Central America or South America, quite often the cheapest way to fly is via the US, but you have to weigh that up against doing something like going through Madrid, where it is an international connection. Yeah,
I'd always go through Amsterdam, not least because both of the guys in Schiphol have come and said they'll buy me a beer, so I'll be there tomorrow about 9 o'clock.
Yeah. Great. Okay. We're going to stay with the US. One of the questions John's been talking to me about recently is how many regional airports in the US have lost service, and you know, that's if you're a small airport and you've lost service, that it's not just an air service that's gone, it's an impact, so an economic impact. It's affects the ability to travel back and forth to a major city and do same-day business. It affects ability to see friends and families and so on. So we had a look at, for American Delta and United, how many airports they currently operate to, what that was in the same week in 2019, and which destinations have been lost and what are new. And I was a bit surprised, I think, because I've been listening to John for too long. I was expecting to see many more airports that were lost, but actually we've got an awful lot of new airports as well.
Yeah, it surprised me as well, and I think what it shows, as much as anything else, is the network churn that constantly is taking place across these airlines. They're always evolving and changing and adjusting their networks. And every time a city loses a carrier, it's an opportunity for someone else to step in. It's rather than see it as a half-empty site opportunity, situation. Look at it from the other side. There is another carrier who may have a different cost base, or who may be more interested in specific connecting flows, who can come in and make that route work. So it's amazingly dynamic and flexible, what we're seeing.
Yeah, and we've seen this replicated. We were doing a piece of work in Europe, and seeing similar things, really, that just the ability of the market to adapt, and new carriers to come in where somebody else has vacated a route. It's quite remarkable, actually, the dynamism we see. Is there anything here that surprises you, Rebecca? Is this your experience in Atlanta? Are you seeing perhaps more routes started than lost?
So it's funny when I look at the Delta, I think so some of them are seasonal in and out of Atlanta, so some of this might just be some seasonality, but several of those that are on the list are ones that no longer fly in and out of Atlanta. Akron, Canton, we used to have service in Atlanta from both Southwest and Delta. That service is completely gone, so that's one there. Wilkes-Barre, Scranton, AVP. I think that we lost that service in 2020 and it hasn't come back. So again, some of these, I think, there's an opportunity from an air service perspective to have either an Allegiant, one of the newer, airlines, a Velo, Breeze come in and service those markets out of Atlanta. That Delta has left and probably is not looking to go back into anytime soon. So the list is not surprising, but I do think that, like John said, there is opportunity for some other airlines to come in and pick up the service.
Yeah, and I accept we've had a comment, maybe February is not the best month to look at, but hey, we're looking at this week, so this is the data. But we're just looking at these 3 airlines here. What we're not showing is whether some of those other airlines have come in and are operating where Delta or American or United have vacated the market. And I know Breeze and Avelo, they're still pretty small, aren't they? But they have grown quite rapidly. So I guess watch this space. We've got one more slide. We wanted to give an opportunity to say something specifically about Atlanta, which we were quite interested in. You're getting your first Ethiopian service, Atlanta to Addis Ababa, admittedly with some tech stops. There's already services to Lagos and Johannesburg and Cape Town with Delta, but this is the first African domiciled service, isn't it, for quite some time for you at Atlanta?
Yes, so this is the second African carrier to fly into Atlanta. The first was South African Airways, and I think they stopped service in 2006. So it's been a long time. We have a big population of African, so a diaspora of Africans in Atlanta. We're very excited about the service. The growth rate between Atlanta and Addis has been like 10% over the last 5 or 6 years. And again, there's a lot of opportunity on the backside of that to have beyond traffic, so connecting in Addis to other areas of Africa. So, it was a great win for us to be able to start this service, and we're very excited.
Yeah, so we generally think of Atlanta as being a hub and about connectivity at Atlanta, but I think this is quite interesting, isn't it? Because as you say, there's a lot of scope for connectivity at Addis, and actually a lot of your market is local for Atlanta, isn't it? The African diaspora, as you say. And I know the traffic data that we've got says in 2019 there was 454,000 people traveling between Atlanta and the African continent, which is a fair number, of which 77% was indirect. So it seems like there's definitely scope for a new direct service, albeit with technical stops.
This may well encourage others in the market as well.
Well, that's what we're hoping.
Who are you suggesting, John?
Well, I'd be happy to tell Rebecca for a consultancy fee. She's, I can think of 1 or 2.
Okay.
I'll have to talk to the powers that be. I can't make a promise like that on a webinar.
So what about the connectivity at Atlanta though? Because obviously Delta is SkyTeam, Ethiopian, Star Alliance. Are we expecting to see any sort of connectivity at the Atlanta end of this route?
So right now, there's not a strong connectivity case. We're working with both Ethiopian and other carriers to try to make more connections. They currently have service in DC and JFK and Newark. Some of those obviously have a lot more Star Alliance members than we do here in Atlanta. But trying to add connectivity is something that we're working on, and we're working with Ethiopian to try to help build that connection in Atlanta.
Great, great. Well, we are just about at time's up, so we will we'll move on from the slides there. I think we've answered pretty much all the questions that have come in as we've been going through. John, do you have any?
There's an outstanding question here from Amstan. It just says when, so I need to get back to them quickly.
Rebecca, talking about connectivity, are there any sort of final thoughts you have about what connectivity, you know, where's the future of connectivity? That's a bit of a broad question, isn't it?
Well, as somebody pointed out, asking one of the largest hubs in the world to answer the question about whether connectivity is important is kind of biased.
Yeah.
But I do think that, again, as the market kind of continues to evolve and grow, that their connectivity will still be important. We're starting to see some of that even on the low cost side, where they're making, you know, joint ventures or partnerships with airlines so that they can get connectivity on the point to point out of, you know, Atlanta or some of the other markets. So I think connectivity will be important in the future. What that looks like is anybody's guess.
Yeah. And John?
Yeah, well, I think it's an indication that the industry is back where it should be. You know, we're seeing more and more connectivity, both domestically, which was occurring during the pandemic, but more international to international connectivity, which means people are traveling, and they're traveling to some of the more obscure parts of the world. And the more connectivity we have, you know, the more indirect traffic flows we have, that ultimately creates sufficient demand for someone to come in and operate that route directly. So, you know, it's part of the evolution of the total market. More connectivity, more traffic leads to more direct services.
Great, thank you both very much. It's been a really interesting discussion. You will be able to access the webinar if you want to on the OEG's website. And I think it's also been sent out, the slides and recordings will be sent out to everybody who's registered. Do sign up to OEG's blog on their website for more information about what's happening in the industry and regular updates on where we're at. We'll be back on Wednesday the 15th of March. So finally, thank you very much, Rebecca, for joining us today, and to John. We'll see you next month. Bye then.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.